So,
So
Okay.
I left off with Lord Weary's Castle. It was a sensation. People were saying this is the best American poetry since Auden. Some may be saying the best poetry since Eliot or Yeats. It got the Pulitzer Prize, and Lowell was appointed consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress, the same position which since 1985 with Robert Penn Warren's accession has been called more in a more fancy way, the poet laureate. Um, and then things started to fall apart. I think that's a fair way to put it. Alan Tate, who knew Lowell very well and was, I think, close to him, said that the three things that kept Cal together were the Catholic Church, his poetry, and his marriage to Jean Stafford. In 1946, he and Stafford had been getting along pretty badly. In 1946, Lowell told her that he wanted a divorce. She said, I thought you were a Catholic. And he said, well, I'm not a Catholic anymore. The church has served its purpose, which to Stafford meant the church has served its literary purpose. And I think that's not really true, but he had already been moving away from the Roman Catholic faith, which he had embraced with enormous enthusiasm. And one reason why we're reading Beyond the Alps, partly because it's a very good poem, but partly because it gives you some sense of why Lowell, after having been such a devout Catholic, stopped being one. Um, so uh, he got divorced from Jean Stafford in 1948. He drifted away from the church, although in 1949 he was back again for a while. And in the late 40s, after Lord Weary's Castle, he found it very difficult to write poetry. There are some poets who are almost always writing. Lowell would have bursts of creativity that sometimes lasted for a few years and periods when he wrote very, very little. Um, so, in Tate's opinion, this was why Lowell, for the first time, really cracked up. But then there is this strange episode at Yaddo. I think one of the least admirable episodes in Lowell's whole career. Yaddo's a writer's colony in or near Saratoga, New York, and
Right down the street from me.
is it
is it
really?
really? That's
Yeah.
cool. Lowell had been there in 1948, 1949. And the poet and translator Robert Fitzgerald, trying to explain what happened, said that there was something unpleasant in the atmosphere of the place at this time. But Lowell got the idea that the director of Yaddo, Elizabeth Ames, and an almost permanent guest, Agnes Smedley, were communists and were part of a sort of communist conspiracy. And they were certainly left wing, maybe obtrusively, and certainly different in their politics from Lowell. But this seems to have been basically a paranoid fantasy, although there were at least three other guests at Yaddo who went along with it. A man named Edward Maisel, about whom I know nothing, Elizabeth Hardwick, the essayist and novelist who became Lowell's second wife, and Flannery O'Connor, who was, of course, a devout Catholic pretty much all her life, but whose politics were not in any simple sense right wing. Um, so there was a hearing in Washington. Lowell said Mrs. Ames should be fired. There was a lot of unpleasantness, and Lowell did not conduct himself well. He made really reckless accusations, and nothing much came of it. But this was kind of the beginning. And then in 1949, Lowell was part of a committee which also included T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, uh, and Carl Shapiro that gave the Bollingen Prize to Ezra Pound for his Peas and Cantos. Um, I think the Peas and Cantos deserve it. But of course, because of Pound's virtually treasonous broadcasts from Rome during World War II, and because of his anti-Semitism, which caused Carl Shapiro to say, "I'm not in favor of this award," and I think his attitudes do vitiate his poetry. There was quite a lot of controversy over it, and it got, there was a pretty strong hostile reaction. Anyway, in spring of 1949, Lowell was visiting some of his old friends. He visited Peter Taylor in Bloomington, Indiana. I'm not sure whom he visited in Chicago, but there was some kind of episode in Chicago. But Bloomington was where it got really bad. Um, Lowell himself, looking back on the episode, says, some years ago, I had an attack of pathological enthusiasm. And he adds, to have known the glory, violence, and banality of such an experience is deeply corrupting. He says, I suspected I was a reincarnation of the Holy Ghost, and had become homicidally hallucinated. He didn't try to kill anybody, but that's his expression for it. And he also says, in a way, this detail I think is the most revealing. I thought I could stop cars by standing in the middle of the street with my arms outstretched. And at one point, he stole a roll of tickets from a theater, got into a physical altercation with the policeman who tried to stop him. Warnings were sent out. There's a crazy poet on the loose named Robert Lowell. He knocked on somebody's door, went into the house, and found a policeman not dressed as a policeman who said, "You must be Robert Lowell." And Lowell almost fainted because he thought it was divine intervention. Um, so I think this was the first time he was put in a mental hospital. The episode didn't last all that long, but it was the first of many such episodes. Somewhere about nine of them by 1965, and more of them later on. Um, let's see. Also in 1949, not long after his release from the mental hospital, he married Elizabeth Hardwick. And this was a marriage that lasted for 23 years. And I think there was a lot of affection and quite a lot of intimacy, intellectual as well as sexual and emotional there. But it seems to me, and though I'm just guessing at this, obviously I don't really know the people, but it seems to me that there was not the same kind of love, at least at the beginning, that Lowell had felt for other women. The marriage ceremony was attended by very few people, and the officiating minister had to remind the small congregation, dearly beloved, we are here for a wedding, not a funeral.
God.
They lived mainly in Boston. Um, in 1955, Lowell's cousin Harriet Winslow, who was uh, 35 years older than he was, and who he said was more than a mother to him, gave them the use of her house in Castine, Maine, because she had a stroke and could no longer use it, and eventually she willed it to them. So Lowell and Hardwick lived mainly in Boston and in the summers in Castine, Maine, till about 1960 when they moved to New York, and continued to summer in Maine, which is to it's surprising that they didn't live there all that much of the time, but it tends to be the setting for many of Lowell's poems, as many as Boston and probably more than New York. Um, 1951, he published The Mills of the Kavanaghs. And the quality of distant, symbol-ridden, and willfully difficult poetry that Lowell noticed in his earlier poetry is worse in The Mills of the Kavanaghs. It's 7 poems. They tend to be long. They're mostly dramatic monologues. One of them, Falling Asleep Over the Aeneid, is, I think, a brilliant poem in which an old man in Boston um, doesn't go to church on Sunday, reads the Aeneid, falls asleep, and dreams that he is Aeneas at the funeral of Pallas, an Italian prince who was an ally of the Trojans and who was killed in the war. And the pagan ceremonies are described very vividly. And at one point, this man who dreams he is Aeneas dreams that the dead Pallas is saying to him, "Try, O child of Aphrodite, try to die. To die is life." So the book was respectfully reviewed, but I think most people felt it was disappointing. And I think one thing you get when you reread it is that the clotted quality that John Crow Ransom didn't like in some of Lowell's earlier poems has got worse. Every line is overpacked with images and allusions and so on. So the power is still there, but it's a book that disappointed most people. And for years after The Mills of the Kavanaghs, Lowell wrote very few poems. Um, let's see. 1954, there was another episode at the University of Cincinnati. Lowell was giving lectures. He lectured on Pound. He lectured on the darker side of Robert Frost. The lectures were brilliant, but people started to feel that he was like starting to spiral out of control, his eyes blazing and so on. And George H. Ford, who wrote a good book on D.H. Lawrence and a book on Dickens, was 6'2" and 200 pounds, and he was advised to sit in the front row in case anything violent happened. Uh,
Whoa.
Nothing violent happened, but it was another episode that ended up with Lowell in a mental hospital. Meanwhile, in 1950, his father had died of a heart attack. Uh, in 1953, Lowell, who had been very close to his mother but had a lot of conflict with her, talked to her frankly and intimately, and it seems to have been a good, kind of not so much patching up of the relationship as like getting to know each other better. And also, I think maybe not coincidentally, in 1953, he started reading Freud and was very enthusiastic because if you think about the Oedipus complex does not necessarily involve a father who is tyrannical or a heavy. Um, as Freud says, you can imagine the father as much more dangerous and tyrannical than he is, and Lowell did. Lowell said, "I am a slavish convert. Every fault is a gold mine of discovery. I am a walking gold mine." So that sounds a little manic too, but it seems to me that the psychoanalytic aspect of Lowell's mental problems could have been followed up more. It doesn't seem to have been very much. In 1954, they put him on Thorazine, which controlled the manic episodes, but apparently has the regular side effect of making people somewhat dazed and out of it. And in 1967, they put him
Oof.
on lithium carbonate,
Yeah.
which apparently isn't as bad, but also has side effects that tend toward dissociation or sort of suspension of feelings. But I don't want to get into the question of what was wrong with Lowell, which he himself didn't claim to know, and what should have been done. I just want to mention some of that. So in the 1950s, he was writing only occasional poems. Beyond the Alps is one of them. Inauguration Day 1953 is another. There's an elegy for George Santayana, a poem to Delmore Schwartz, words for Hart Crane. Um, but only toward the end of the 50s did he really hit another very creative period, writing about his family. And the first two sections of life studies are very good, the first three. The second one is a prose memoir called 91 Revere Street. I first read Lowell when I was about 19 years old, and I was puzzled by Lord Weary's Castle, The Mills of the Kavanaghs, and wasn't quite sure if I liked the life study poems. But I disliked 91 Revere Street because it seemed to me that he was remembering his childhood and youth and his parents only with distaste. Rereading it, I see an affection, an amusement, a kind of disinterested analytic intelligence that I didn't see when I first read it because that sense of this is not fair to do to your own childhood self and it's not fair to do to your parents dominated it for me. And I think that prose autobiography or fragmentary autobiography is really pretty important. Alan Tate got many of these poems from Lowell in 1957, and he wrote back that Skunk Hour was very fine. Um, Inauguration Day was publishable, but most of these poems were definitely bad. He said Lowell was always dealing with intractable material, but there used to be a formal ordering. There used to be a symbolic order, which were no longer there. And then Tate makes, I think, a very acute observation. The poems are composed of unassimilated details, terribly intimate and coldly noted. And that was pretty much my first reaction too. And they are composed of details that don't add up to a narrative. But I don't think they are unassimilated. They are terribly intimate. And the coldness with which they are noted is, I think, partly an illusion. There is a lot of feeling there. The feeling is restrained, but I think it's there. By the time the book came out, Lowell was again in a mental hospital, I think the Payne Whitney in New York, and he didn't see the reviews, most of which were very positive. One of which in the Hudson Review said this is a privileged man writing snobbish poetry about his big connections. But mostly they were very positive, and it isn't known whether Lowell actually saw any of them when they came out. But he did get a letter that Alan Tate wrote to him, and Tate had changed his mind. He said, your book is magnificent. Everything will be well." Um, I want to read a couple of critical discussions of life studies before I get into the poems. One of them is essentially a blurb, but it's much more thoughtful than most blurbs, and it's by Elizabeth Bishop. As a child, I used to look at my grandfather's Bible under a powerful reading glass. The letters assembled beneath the lens were suddenly like a Lowell poem, as big as life and as alive and rainbow edged. It seemed to illuminate as it magnified. It could also be used as a burning glass. This new book begins on Robert Lowell's now familiar trumpet notes, see Inauguration Day. Then, with the autobiographical group called Life Studies, the tone changes. In these poems, heartbreaking, shocking, grotesque, and gentle, the unhesitant attack, the imagery and construction are as brilliant as ever, but the mood is nostalgic and the meter is refined. A poem like My Last Afternoon with Uncle Devereux Winslow or Skunk Hour can tell us as much about the state of society as a volume of Henry James at his best. Whenever I read a poem by Robert Lowell, I have a chilling sensation of here and now, of exact contemporaneity, more aware of those ironies of American history, grimmer about them, and yet hopeful. If more people read poetry, if it were more exportable and translatable, surely his poems would go far towards changing, or at least unsettling, minds made up against us. Somehow or other, by fair means or foul, and in the middle of our worst century so far, we have produced a magnificent poet. The other discussion I want to save until we've looked at the first two poems, which are of a different kind from the life studies poems themselves, Beyond the Alps and Inauguration Day, January 1953. So if you could go to screen sharing with Beyond the Alps. Okay. On the train from Rome to Paris, 1950, the year Pius XII defined the dogma of Mary's bodily assumption. Reading how even the Swiss had thrown the sponge in once again, and Everest was still unscaled, I watched our Paris Pullman lunge mooning across the fallow alpine snow. Oh, bella Roma! I saw the stewards go forward on tiptoe, banging on their gongs. Life changed to landscape. Much against my will, I left the city of God where it belongs. There the skirt-mad Mussolini unfurled the eagle of Caesar. He was one of us only, pure prose. I envy the conspicuous waste of our grandparents on their grand tours. Long-haired Victorian sages accepted the universe while breezing on their trust funds through the world. When the Vatican made Mary's Assumption dogma, the crowds in San Pietro screamed, "Papa!" The Holy Father dropped his shaving glass and listened. His electric razor purred. His pet canary chirped on his left hand. The lights of science couldn't hold a candle to Mary, risen at one miraculous stroke, angel winged, gorgeous as a jungle bird. But who believed this? Who could understand? Pilgrims still kissed St. Peter's brazen sandal. The Duce's lynched, bare, booted skull still spoke. God herded his people to the coup de grace. The costumed Switzers sloped their pikes to push, O pious, through the monstrous human crush. Our mountain climbing train had come to earth. Tired of the querulous hush-hush of the wheels, the blear-eyed ego kicking in my berth lay still and saw Apollo plant his heels on terra firma through the morning's thigh. There were no tickets for that altitude once held by Hellas, when the goddess stood, priest, pope, philosopher and golden bow, pure mind and murder at the scything prow, Minerva, the miscarriage of the brain. Now Paris, our black classic, breaking up like killer kings on an Etruscan cup. That is a very strange poem, but I think it does hold together, although it seems to keep shooting off in all directions. The Catholic Church and the dogma of the Virgin Mary's bodily assumption into heaven, I'll come to that in a moment. Rome, Mussolini, the Alps, the pagan gods, the lights of science, which are not given very much room, and finally that obscure but powerful final couplet, now Paris, our black classic, breaking up like killer kings on an Etruscan cup. I think Lowell recognizes that he can't really buy the doctrines of the Catholic Church anymore. But there is a sadness in this, and I think a yearning for a certainty which he has lost. And then we get all sorts of evocations of the ancient world, Minerva, Apollo, and so on, Caesar, and the modern world, Mussolini and Italian fascism, the train crossing the Alps so that the passengers can rest comfortably while they go over these formidable mountains, the Pope's electric razor, and so on. Okay, do people know what the dogma of Mary's bodily assumption is?
Mhm.
Yeah. Laurel's nodding, but I don't know if anybody else is. Just very briefly,
Yeah.
um, she was, the mother of God. And there was no problem in the early church about imagining her soul as immediately going to heaven when she died. But apparently, a popular belief grew up that it wasn't just her soul, but her, let's say, resurrected body, that she was removed body and soul to heaven. And I believe this was a popular idea for a long time before in 1950 Pope Pius XII made it a dogma of the Catholic Church. And it is pretty extreme. You think of a woman who was not herself God, though the mother of God, carried to heaven instantly, body and soul. So Lowell is not saying this can't be true, but he really, those are searching questions. But who believed this? Who could understand? Who could even understand what was being asserted in this new dogma? And of course, by the time he wrote the poem, he was no longer a Catholic. Everest had been climbed by Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, and other things had changed as well. And probably Pius was no longer alive. He died in 1957. Um, okay, one more thing. Uh, it seems to me that the moment at which this poem really seems to be going off the rails is one of the more memorable moments. After mentioning Mussolini and saying he was one of us only, pure prose, no poetry about Mussolini, I envy the conspicuous waist of our grandparents on their grand tours. Long-haired Victorian sages accepted the universe while breezing on their trust funds through the world. Lowell's obviously suggesting it's easier to accept the universe if you're living on a trust fund and can breeze through the world, as Victorian travelers often breeze through Europe anyway. The remark, I accept the universe, was apparently made by Margaret Fuller, not exactly the person one thinks of when one thinks of a long haired Victorian sage. But the story is that she said somewhere, I accept the universe. And Thomas Carlyle, who was a long-haired Victorian sage, responded to that, Gad, she'd better. That is, you have no choice but to accept the universe. This is where you are. One more observation. The goddess who is Pope, priest, philosopher, and golden bough is a Greek goddess, as Lowell writes about her. And the name Athena is metrically just the same as Minerva. He could have called her Athena, but it's a sign of Lowell's focus much more on the Romans than on the Greeks that he calls this goddess of wisdom, domestic arts, the olive tree, and war by her Roman name rather than by her Greek name. Anyway, let me stop. I've gone on kind of long. What do you think of the poem, or what? Anybody?
I was wondering what the Black Classic was. Uh, uh,
I don't know. That's a very difficult or strange couplet. I don't know why Paris is black. Classic, sure. I mean, Walter Benjamin started to write a book called Paris, the Capital of the 19th Century, but I'm not sure why the color word black. And I'm not sure why Etruscan kings, except that the Etruscan kings, once the kings were driven out of Rome, really belonged to the past, and very little is known about the Etruscans. And so there's a suggestion Paris also is not going to last forever.
mm,
Paris, the city of light, meaning in part enlightenment, as opposed to Rome, the city of God. He's between the two of them, and he's not really
mm,
too at home in either one.
mhm.
I've got a theory that when he refers to an Etruscan cup, the the surface is black with the artwork engraved into it to reveal the
Mhm.
terracotta, and most of the ones we have found are broken and have to be put back together.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So yeah,
that figures.
yeah.
Well, it's interesting to me of how much he's trying to put into here,
Mhm.
right? I'm,
Yes.
you're trying to take this all in because you start here and then you go here, it's like,
Yeah,
yeah, um,
it's
uh,
all over the place.
yeah. I mean, that's not necessarily bad, but there's a lot to take in.
Mhm.
As I'm thinking about it, I'm kind of following, and then we jump to here and then jump to here, um, which is a which is a not a bad adventure. I mean, or a bad journey, but
Mhm.
he can't just do one thing.
No, he can't. Although I think the language in life studies is much clearer and much easier to follow than in the two earlier books. And I think on the whole, that's an advantage. But the way his mind works is not necessarily much easier to follow. Maybe we should move on. Inauguration Day, January 1953, I think is unfair to Dwight David Eisenhower. Um, but Lowell liked Adlai Stevenson, and Stevenson was derided as the candidate of the eggheads, that is, of intellectuals. And I think his main point is not personal about Eisenhower, uh, but has to do with the analogy between Eisenhower and Ulysses S. Grant. A very successful general in a very bloody war with not much knowledge of politics or interest in politics, although they were certainly both intelligent men, elected president because he was a successful general, and that's the main reason. And the way the rhyme comes down heavily on the nickname Ike, I think really does show a certain scorn. Um, Eisenhower, at this point in our history, looks better than he did in the 1950s. But I remember my father always used to say we were liberal Democrats and great admirers of Franklin Roosevelt. He said Eisenhower was a good man. He never should have let them make him president. The snow had buried Stuyvesant. The subways drummed the vaults. I heard the L's green girders charge on Third, Manhattan's truss of adamant that groaned in ermine, slummed on want. Cyclonic zero of the word, God of our armies, who interred Cold Harbor's blue immortals, grant. Horseman, your sword is in the groove. Ice, ice, our wheels no longer move. Look, the fixed stars, all just alike as Lackland atoms split apart, and the Republic summons Ike, the mausoleum in her heart. Do you get what that mausoleum is doing there?
Mm-mm.
Grant's tomb,
Yeah,
one of
yeah.
the most conspicuous buildings in New York,
Yeah.
not distinguished architecturally, but it's huge. And he's saying, in effect, they've just elected Eisenhower for the same reason they elected Ulysses Grant. Grant was personally honest, but he presided over one of the more corrupt administrations in American history. Eisenhower's administration was not corrupt in that way, but again, the suggestion, not just that this is the choice of a general who may have been a fine general but shouldn't be president, but that there is something of the mausoleum about the choice, which suggests not only Grant's tomb, but all the war dead of World War II, and that there is something dying or dead in the American Republic. That seems like one of the simpler poems, and it is that note of satire which you rarely get. He certainly is weird. I agree with Laurel's comment. Um, he probably would have been pleased with that comment too. Um, at any rate, Jarrell thought that this satirical vein was the weakest aspect of Lowell's poetry, and there is much less of it as time goes on. The life studies poems are divided into two groups: 11 poems, three about his grandparents, and especially about his grandfather, Arthur Winslow, a kind-hearted, rough, domineering old man whom Lowell was much closer to than he was to his own father. Four poems about his father, focusing mainly on his father's death, one on his mother after her death, and then three poems about his current life, one mainly about his little daughter, Harriet, who was born to Elizabeth Hardwick in 1957, and the other two, one about being in a mental hospital, probably McLean's near Boston, and the other one, Home After 3 Months Away. And they're wonderful poems, especially my last afternoon with Uncle Devereux Winslow, I think is one of Lowell's best poems, but it's long, and I hesitated to include it because it's so long. And then I read that Lowell said these 11 poems really form one sequence, and you can't take one apart and have it apart from the others. And then the second part of the life study sequence, of which I have assigned three of the four poems. The fourth is a very good poem, too, and one of his most affectionate poems about Elizabeth Hardwick, but it doesn't fit in very well with To Speak of Woe That Is in Marriage. It's supposed to fit in, but I think it doesn't. So if you'll indulge me, this is a long comment. It's from John Thompson, a friend of Lowell's, who had helped him in two of his psychotic episodes, and he wrote it in the Kenyon Review. And I think it gives you a sense of what these life study poems are doing better than any other critical thing I've come across. In these poems, there are depths of the self that in life are not ordinarily acknowledged and in literature are usually figured in disguise. Traditionally, between the persona of the creation and the person of the creator, a certain distance exists. And this has been so even for lyric poets and their utterances, habitually inclined to the first person as they are. The vices of fiction or concealment, large or small, accomplish this estrangement. Robert Lowell's new poems show that this distance between persona and poem is not, after all, important to art, but has been a reflection of the way our culture conceives character. This conception seems to be dwindling now to a mere propriety. And for these poems, the question of propriety no longer exists. They have made a conquest. What they have won is a major expansion of the territory of poetry. The voice of Robert Lowell's poetry has always had the authority of the extreme. No conflict is glossed over or rationalized by a system of ideas. His religion was always entirely eschatological. The world he describes, ancient or modern, is never influenced by religion, but only threatened by it. It is as if he could bear to contemplate this world only because he could momentarily expect its total destruction or total delivery. Thus, the one thing this poet never worried about in his writing was how to go on living. This has given him great strength, which he still has. The new poems have abandoned the myths of eschatology and the masks of heroes, but the violence and guilt, the unalleviated seizure of experience, these remain. This is why, perhaps alone of living poets, he can bear for us the role of the great poet, the man who on a very large scale sees more, feels more, and speaks more bravely about it than we ourselves can do. He can speak now of the most desperate, uh, most second. I've got to uh, check this. Uh, I don't remember what the next adjective is, but something like he can speak now of the most desperate and sordid personal experience with full dignity. Nothing need be explained, accounted for, or moralized. I will say one thing, that this expansion of the territory of poetry is not entirely a good thing. And I will never forget Leslie's brilliant remark about poems that seem to be mainly prose selfies. And I think, even some of Lowell's late poems are a lot like prose selfies. And those who write about personal experience without Lowell's art are often apt to end up with prose selfies rather than real poems. But these are real poems, and I haven't left as much time as I should have to get to them. So let's get to West Street and Lepke.
Uh,
Lepke's, yeah, can you do
okay.
perception?
Yeah, yeah.
And
Got
can
it.
I talk while you're,
Yeah.
okay. Lepke's real name was Louis Buchalter, and he was a very successful hitman and the uh, director of an organization of hitmen known as Murder Incorporated.
Okay.
Only teaching on Tuesdays, bookworming in pajamas fresh from the washer each morning. I hog a whole house on Boston's hardly passionate Marlborough Street, where even the man scavenging filth in the back alley trash cans has two children, a beach wagon, a helpmate, and is a young Republican. I have a 9 months daughter, young enough to be my granddaughter. Like the sun, she rises in her flame flamingo infant's wear. These are the tranquilized 50s. and I am 40. Ought I to regret my seed time? I was a fire-breathing Catholic CO and made my manic statement, telling off the state and president, and then sat waiting sentence in the bullpen beside a Negro boy with curlicues of marijuana in his hair. Given a year, I walked on the roof of the West Street jail, a short enclosure like our school soccer court, and saw the Hudson River once a day through sooty clothesline entanglements and bleaching khaki tenements. Strolling, I yammered metaphysics with Abramowitz, a jaundice yellow, it's really tan, and flyweight pacifist. So vegetarian, he wore rope shoes and preferred fallen fruit. He tried to convert Bioff and Brown, the Hollywood pimps, to his diet. Hairy, muscular, suburban, wearing chocolate double-breasted suits, they blew their tops and beat him black and blue. I was so out of things I'd never heard of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Are you a CO? I asked a fellow jailbird. No, he answered. I'm a JW. He taught me the hospital tuck and pointed out the t-shirted back of Murder Incorporated Czar Lepke, there piling towels on the rack, or dawdling off to his little segregated cell full of things forbidden the common man, a portable radio, a dresser, two toy American flags tied together with a wreath of Easter palm. Flabby, bald, lobotomized, he drifted in a sheepish calm, where no agonizing reappraisal jarred his concentration on the electric chair, hanging like an oasis in his air of lost connections.
That's such a great poem.
Okay, any comments on that? I think that is quite clear. I'm just interested in people's reactions.
Well, I don't know how clear it is, but hanging like an oasis,
Yes,
the electric chair hanging like an oasis, oh my God.
I
That's
know.
all I have to say.
Yes, I agree. That is really startling. It's like Lepke is so out of it and so, damaged, though not necessarily conscience stricken, that death by the electric chair seems like an oasis. And of course, there are lost connections all the way through Lowell's poetry, and many of them in life studies.
The word 50s, italicized too, jumped out at me.
Mhm.
That we think of the 50s as kind of a dry time,
Mhm.
culturally,
Yeah,
and he's just saying that exact thing.
yeah. Tranquilized, I think, is a very good word there.
Yeah.
Although I.F. Stone wrote a book called The Haunted 50s, and they were less complacent and less unified than we sometimes tend to remember them as being. But, they were the years of widespread television for the first time and, many other things.
A
The
lot of
opening of
tranquilizers.
a lot of tranquilizers, the opening of Disneyland, Eisenhower's presidency, and so on.
Yeah,
Well, but
I recommend the early work of John D. MacDonald. He has
Yes.
these dime store novels that are about suburban infidelity and all kinds of debauchery in the 50s, and they're very tranquilized, but very
Yeah.
readable.
I've read
but
one. I like MacDonald.
but after going through the Depression and World War II, weren't they deserving of some tranquilization? I mean, my God! And also Eisenhower was kind of a tranquilized president, but
Yes.
he he was not like a Patton. He was a
Hmm.
in order to keep the alliance between Britain and America together during that war, that was not an easy task, and it had to be done by a guy with a very calm mind because you
Absolutely.
had Montgomery and Patton. You had these crazy people that he
Yeah.
had to keep in line, and so that's probably what he was used to, was tranquilizing people, and that's what he did to the country, and I don't fault him for it.
I pretty much agree with that. And there are things in Eisenhower's administration that I definitely respect, like sending the troops to Little Rock when the desegregation crisis occurred. His foreign policy, not so much, but I think that's also true of Truman's foreign policy. And, it's not only Eisenhower. But that's a fair enough comment. The country was prosperous. Lowell was prosperous. But there is still an uneasy sense that all is not well. Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe there's a connection, finally, in his poetry between the tranquilized 50s
Mhm.
and the tranquilized violence of Lepke at the end, where he's got his had his lobotomy.
Very good point.
Um, because you've got even I I like this poem because it just made me laugh. Some of these
Mhm.
comments
Me
about
too.
There's a lot
the
more humor.
flyweight pacifist. He's so vegetarian. He wore rope shoes. He's a Quaker, is what he is. Wore rope shoes and preferred fallen fruit. And then these guys buy off in Brown who somehow are wearing brown chocolate double-breasted suits instead of prison garb.
Yeah.
Just beat him to
I don't know about
smithereens.
that, but
You
they
know,
were
just
real. They were real.
they're
Willie
real.
Byoff and Willie Brown.
Yeah, and they're real. It's got this mix of people in the prison where, but some of the violence is still there and a threat, and you have to do the hospital tuck.
Mhm.
But ending with this picture of lobotomized Lepke, I think ties it together with the earlier talking about the 50s. Did we know in the 50s? I always heard of it talked as being sort of complacent and everything, but were we aware of how complacent we were in the 50s? I'm trying to think back to that time of my life and my parents and everything. Were they just relieved, as you said, relieved the war was over and they were finally getting a house and things like that?
Mhm.
Well, they also had a sense of triumph. I mean, and not just had they what they would have seen as been morally triumphant. They were the only industrial nation left standing, and so everybody got rich real fast.
Yeah.
And that
The
seemed to be
women
a
had babies.
Calvinist. What's that?
All the women had babies. It was, the
All
baby.
women had babies. Of course, black people weren't yet triumphant,
No.
but this seemed like a Calvinist confirmation of the moral superiority of the United States. Wouldn't you feel kind of complacent and full of yourself?
Yeah.
Probably. I remember the 50s happily, but I was a little boy then.
Yeah.
Well, and at the same time, yeah, the complacency, there's this old story about Nixon and Khrushchev in the kitchen in Moscow and how it was, but you'd also had this kind of a turmoil about the emergence of rock and roll, and that's breaking up the tranquility. So no era is as much like its stereotype as it might
Yeah,
be.
for sure.
But this is a really I like this poem, right?
I think it's one of his best.
Yeah.
Can we move
Well,
on?
wait, I just want to say one
Yeah,
thing. Think about that anxiety about the nuclear age.
yeah,
Oh God, yeah. We all the duck and cover. We all
yeah,
did that.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember what I remember about Ike, because I still have my I like Ike button. But I think that was the last time my parents were Republican. But what I remember is the U2 scandal because we believed that America, as you say, was more sort of morally pure somehow, and that the president could not lie to his own citizens.
Yep.
Yeah.
And when that happened, for me, even as a little kid, that popped a big bubble.
Mhm.
Mm.
Okay, the next two poems are about marriage. I am. Man and Wife is a really rather tender poem to Elizabeth Hardwick, where Lowell writes, "All night I've held your hand as if you had a fourth time faced the kingdom of the mad and dragged me home alive." And it's very tender, but it ends with her old-fashioned tirade, loving, rapid, merciless. And originally, that poem and To Speak of Woe That Is Marriage were part of the same poem, but they really don't fit together because the woman's tirade in To Speak of Woe That Is in Marriage is rapid and merciless, all right, but it is not loving. And you can't take this as straight autobiography, but it apparently does include a few things that Elizabeth Hardwick actually said. To Speak of Woe That Is in Marriage is, of course, the wife of Bath and Chaucer. She says, I can say a lot about woe that is in marriage, but I didn't suffer any woe. I was the whip. Um, it is the future generation that presses into being by means of these exuberant feelings and supersensible soap bubbles of ours. Arthur Schopenhauer. The hot night makes us keep our bedroom windows open. Our magnolia blossoms. Life begins to happen. My hopped up husband leaves his home disputes and hits the streets to cruise for prostitutes, freelancing out along the razor's edge. This screwball might kill his wife, then take the pledge. Oh, the monotonous meanness of his lust. It's the injustice. He is so unjust. Whiskey blind, swaggering home at 5. My only thought is how to keep alive. What makes him tick? Each night now I tie $10 and his car key to my thigh. Galled by the climacteric of his want, he stalls above me like an elephant. Yeah, again, it's terrible, but it's funny too. But I'd like to move on directly to Skunk
Well, I
Out.
have a quick question.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick question? So I read somewhere that he actually used material from his wife's letters,
Yes, that was
and that
in.
a lot of people were furious with him for that
Mhm.
invasion of privacy. Is this one of those?
No, apparently Elizabeth Hardwick had no objection to the way she appears in Life Studies.
Okay.
This was after their marriage had broken up, in a book called The Dolphin, where he used some of her letters, caused a lot of pain. Elizabeth Bishop told him not to. She said, these are magnificent poems, but art just isn't worth that much. And others, who were less close to Lowell than Bishop were much less kind about that. I will say a little bit about it next week, but I don't want to get into that today. And I think it is worth noting that Elizabeth Hardwick had no objection, apparently, to this dramatic monologue, which, of course, people would associate with her, though I'm sure it is, not actually her words. But I can imagine her saying this screwball might kill his wife, then take the pledge, for example. So Anne says I shouldn't talk about Skunk Hour today because, it is after 1 o'clock. That means that on next Tuesday, we have three of Lowell's most ambitious poems, but I'll be saying less about his biography, and I think we can do it. Skunk Hour, um, for the Union Dead, also Night Sweat, which I may pay less attention to, though it's a good poem, and Waking Early Sunday Morning. So that those four poems seem like a lot for one class, but obviously time has run out, and it always used to when I always used to teach undergraduates.
Uh, Peter, would you comment on the dynamic between his insanity, his marriage tranquility, if there was any, and his writing?
Well, there was some tranquility. He and Elizabeth Hardwick often seemed like a very affectionate, long married couple. And they also had a lot of intellectual interests in common. In 1963, she was actively involved in founding the New York Review of Books, and he gave them some money and encouraged them. He wasn't as actively involved, but it was a project for both of them. Um, let's see. One thing about Hardwick is that she was willing to drag him back from the kingdom of the mad and face its hackneyed speech, its homicidal eye. She wasn't easily alienated or easily upset. What did bother her was every manic episode practically seemed to be accompanied by a very big crush on some young woman or other, generally women that Lowell didn't know well.
And Elizabeth Bishop.
Uh, well, it was preceded by amorous advances to Elizabeth Bishop, who he knew perfectly well was a lesbian, though a very good friend of his. But there tended to be a girl somewhere there that Lowell was thinking about leaving Elizabeth Hardwick for. And obviously she didn't like that. But she seems to have been very patient. And the episodes, though they would sometimes last weeks or a month or two, were not the main thing in their life together. It's just the fear of them was always there. Lowell also was afraid of them. W.H. Auden said there were three warning signs which told you Lowell was about to have a manic episode. One, he announces that he is the only living poet. Two, a romantic and usually platonic relationship with a young girl. And three, he gives a huge party. So
Tony, I think they're tearing
that's
down
about
your
all I
house. You
can
better
say.
check it out.
Yeah,
It's a
something's
fair
going on.
question.
Yeah, there's
Biography
it's
is good. You get a lot from the biography.
the
Um,
also the how did that interweave with his writing? Did he write when he was manic? Did he write when he
Well,
was
he was asked about that once, and he said, "I couldn't possibly write when I'm manic." His manic states involved a kind of overexcitement in which his mind was like, like an engine that is about to explode. So he didn't write when he was manic. Sometimes his creative phases shaded off into a manic episode, but by that time he was no longer writing. And he also says, I think I've quoted this before, none of my books was written when I was manic, and the only book that was written when I was depressed was for the Union Dead, and I was
right?
only mildly depressed then. The depression doesn't seem to have been anywhere near as serious. People, there is really extreme depression. Lowell's doesn't seem to have been extreme. It seems to have been mainly the reaction of shame and humiliation after the manic episodes. So that's the best I can do on that. But whatever you say about a poet's madness, Michael Drayton wrote about Christopher Marlowe, and that fine madness still he did maintain, which always should possess a poet's brain. Lowell's mania was not that fine madness, which should possess a poet's brain. It was something related but different. Okay.
I just have a quick comment I heard from Douglas. He said to tell you guys he will be back.
Good.
Good. Yeah, we miss him.
Good.
Anybody know how Meredith is doing?
I actually got a message from Jeff, and he said that her brain fog from the chemo was so severe that she had to have help to manage, and so they were going to take her off the chemo and go to radiation.
Mm.
So that's why we haven't been hearing from her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks. And I'm gonna email all of you. I have an idea about the future, so look for an email from me, okay?
All right.
Okay, bye. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.